The county closed the Sunder Creek Trail on April 14, 1996. I know the exact date because my mother drove me out there the weekend before to walk it one last time. And when we got to the trailhead, the notice was already stapled to the post. She tore it off and put it in her purse. I still have it. The paper went yellow a long time ago, but the language is clear enough. Trail closed by order of the Dent County Commission, effective April 14, 1996, due to unresolved right-of-way dispute. Access prohibited beyond this point. Violators subject to citation. I was 14. I'd been walking that trail with my mother since I was 8. 6 miles from the gravel pull-off on Route TT down through second-growth oak and hickory. Across Sunder Creek twice on those flat limestone slabs someone had dragged into position decades before we ever found them. Then up through the cedar breaks to the old Prader homestead clearing where you could see the river if the leaves were off. It wasn't a famous trail. It wasn't in any guidebook. It was a county-maintained path that crossed 2 private parcels under easements that dated back to the 1940s. And when the second landowner's estate changed hands in the mid-90s, the new owner refused to honor the easement. And the county decided that a lawsuit over 6 miles of footpath in the middle of nowhere wasn't worth the money. So they closed it. And for 30 years, as far as the public record is concerned, it stayed closed. I'm telling you this now because of what I found when I went back last week, and because of who I think put it there, and because I need someone other than me to sit with the part I can't make sense of. My name doesn't matter for this. What matters is that I write regional trail guides for a living. I've been doing it for 11 years. Ozarks, Ouachitas, the Boston Mountains, the Arkansas River Hills, and increasingly the overlooked Missouri side where the terrain is rougher and the documentation is worse. I'm not a ranger. I'm not a scientist. I'm a person who walks trails and writes about them accurately enough that other people can follow what I wrote without getting hurt or lost. That's the whole job. I was working on a revised edition of a guide that covers the Upper Merrimack and Courtois Creek watersheds when I started thinking about Sunder Creek again. Not for the guide. The trail is still officially closed, but I was already in the area for 3 days of field work on legal trails nearby, and I had a free afternoon, and I hadn't been back to Dent County since my mother's funeral in 2018. I'd driven past the Route TT turnoff 100 times in the years between, and every time I thought about stopping, and every time I didn't. If you find yourself drawn to stories about forgotten places in American backcountry, the kind of accounts where someone goes back to a place that's been left alone for decades and finds something they weren't ready for, you might want to subscribe to Ashwarden Horror. There's more where this is going. I parked at the pull-off on a Wednesday afternoon in late July. It was hot. Mid-90s, cicadas so loud they sounded mechanical. The kind of Missouri summer heat that sits on your chest the moment you open the car door. The pull-off itself looked almost exactly as I remembered it. Room for maybe 4 cars on a flat shoulder of crushed limestone. 1 metal post where the trailhead sign used to be. The sign was gone, and the post had been cut off about 8 inches above the ground with what looked like a reciprocating saw. The cut clean and horizontal, not rusted much, which meant it had been done in the last few years rather than the last few decades. That was the first thing I noticed. Not that the sign was missing, but that someone had bothered to remove it recently. If you close a trail and the sign falls down or rots away, that's neglect. If you close a trail and someone comes out with a power tool and cuts the post, that's maintenance. Those are different things. The second thing I noticed was the trail itself. From the pull-off, the old path used to drop immediately into the trees through a gap between 2 big post oaks. Both oaks were still there, bigger now, their canopy closing most of the gap overhead. But the ground between them was clear. Not overgrown and recently cleared. Not bulldozed. Clear the way a trail stays clear when feet keep using it. The soil was packed. Leaf litter sat on both sides, but the center line, maybe 18 inches wide, showed bare dirt with that slightly concave profile you get from steady foot traffic over time. I stood there for probably 2 minutes, just looking at it. 30 years of closure. No legal access, no maintenance budget. And the trail looked walked. I want to be clear about what I was thinking at that point, because it wasn't mysterious. It was annoying. Closed trails get used all the time. Hunters ignore closures. Local kids ignore closures. Mushroom pickers, ginseng diggers. People who've always walked a certain path and see no reason to stop because a county commission said so. In rural Missouri, a trail closure without a physical barrier is basically a suggestion. I assumed that's what I was seeing. Locals had kept walking the trail because nobody was enforcing the closure. And the closure itself was a bureaucratic artifact of a property dispute that probably hadn't mattered to anyone on the ground in decades. So I walked in. I didn't have a great justification for it. I wasn't going to write about an officially closed trail in a guidebook. I just wanted to see it again. I wanted to see if the creek crossings were still there, if the cedar breaks still smelled the way I remembered, if the Prader clearing still had that view. I told myself I'd walk a mile, maybe 2, and turn around. The first quarter mile was exactly what I expected. Dense oak hickory forest, the canopy high enough that the understory was mostly open. The trail threading between the trunks on a slight downhill grade toward the creek bottom. The footing was good. Better than good, actually. There were no blowdowns across the trail. On every maintained trail I survey for work, I encounter blowdowns. Trees fall, storms knock limbs down. On a busy trail, volunteers cut them out within weeks. On a less traveled trail, you might step over a dozen in a mile. Here, in 30 years of official closure, I didn't step over a single one in the first quarter mile. I noticed that. I filed it the way I file observations on any trail. Someone's been clearing this. Probably the same locals who've been walking it. Not unusual for a rural community trail. People take ownership. At about 1/3 of a mile, I hit the first creek approach, where the trail drops steeply through a rocky chute to the first limestone crossing. This section had always been the roughest part. The slope is maybe 40 degrees, loose chert over clay. And when I was a kid, my mother used to hold my hand through it, and we'd both slide a little on every step. What I found was a set of steps. Not natural steps. Not the kind of water bar erosion control you see on maintained trails. Actual stone steps, maybe 15 of them, set into the slope with their flat faces up and their bases buried deep enough that they didn't shift when I put my full weight on each one. The stone was local. Dent County is full of dolomite and chert. But these had been selected for flatness and fitted to the slope with a precision that spoke to real labor. Hours of labor. Someone had carried or levered these stones into position, dug the beds, and set them firmly enough that they'd survived years of freeze-thaw and runoff without displacement. I knelt on the 3rd step and looked at the joint where stone met soil. Moss had grown into the seam. Not a skim of moss. Deep, established moss with a root structure that takes years to develop. These steps hadn't been placed last month. They'd been here long enough to become part of the hillside. The creek crossing at the bottom was still there. Same flat limestone slabs, but they'd been rearranged. When I was a kid, there were 5 slabs spanning Sunder Creek, and you had to hop between them, and the 3rd one always wobbled. Now there were 7, laid edge to edge in a continuous line, and the gaps between them had been chinked with smaller flat stones, so tightly fitted that the surface was almost level. Creek water flowed under and between them, but the walking surface was dry and stable. I crossed it without getting my boots wet, which had never once happened when I was 14. I stopped on the far side and sat on a rock and drank some water and tried to figure out what I was looking at. This was not casual local use. Someone had done masonry out here. Careful, patient, skilled stonework, deep in a closed trail in a rural county where the official position was that no one had any business being here. The work was too good to be recent. The moss, the settling, the way the stones had weathered to match the surrounding rock. This wasn't last year. This was years of effort. I kept going. The trail beyond the first crossing ran level through a bottomland flat where sycamores leaned over the creek. And here the maintenance was different. The trail surface was covered in a thin layer of wood chips, not landscaping bark from a hardware store. Hand-chipped wood, irregular in size, the kind you get from splitting rounds with a hatchet and then breaking the splinters down. The chips were old, partially decomposed, but the layer was even, spread deliberately to manage mud in what would be a soggy section during spring runoff. I've seen this technique on volunteer-maintained trails in state parks. It's simple and effective, but it requires hauling material to the site, and this was more than a mile from the nearest road. The thing that changed my thinking, the thing that made me stop treating this as a curiosity and start paying closer attention, was the blazes. The original Sunder Creek Trail had never been blazed. It was a county trail, not a Forest Service trail. And county trails in rural Missouri are generally just paths. You follow the path. If you can't find the path, you go home. But now, at irregular intervals, I was seeing small marks on trees at roughly eye height. Not paint blazes, carved marks. Each one was a simple vertical line, about 3 inches tall, cut into the bark with a knife or chisel, deep enough to scar the cambium, but shallow enough that the tree had healed partially around them, leaving a raised ridge of bark tissue. The oldest ones I could find were almost fully healed, just a faint raised line on mature oaks that had to be 20 or 30 years of growth old. The newest ones, on younger trees, were fresher, the exposed wood still pale. Someone had been blazing this trail over a period of years, possibly the entire 30 years it had been closed. I want to explain why that unsettled me more than the stonework. The stonework was impressive, but it was anonymous. You can't read intention into a well-placed rock beyond the obvious. Someone wanted this crossing to be easier. But blazes are communication. Blazes say, "Follow me. Someone come this way." The trail continues. Blazes are for other people. And if you're blazing a closed trail that no one is supposed to be walking, you're either expecting someone, or you're maintaining a fiction that the closure doesn't exist, or you're talking to yourself in a language that only makes sense if there's a listener. I checked my phone. No signal, which I expected. I checked the time. I'd been on the trail for about an hour, and based on my pace and the terrain, I was maybe 1.75 miles in, approaching the section where the trail leaves the creek bottom and begins climbing through the cedar breaks. I told myself I would walk to the cedar line and then turn around. I was alone. No one knew I was here, and the smart move was to respect my own rule about solo off-grid hiking, which is that you always leave more daylight than you think you need. The climb out of the creek bottom was where the trail used to get vague. I remember my mother and I losing it once in this section and bushwhacking uphill through scrub until we hit the cedars and reoriented. But now, the path was unmistakable. Cut into the slope with the same careful grading as the stone steps below, switchbacking twice where the old trail had gone straight up the fall line. The switchbacks were new. They didn't exist in my memory. Someone had rerouted the trail to reduce erosion and improve the grade, which is exactly what a professional trail designer would do, and exactly what no casual local user would bother with. At the top of the climb, where the cedars begin, I found the bench. A simple wooden bench, maybe 4 feet long, made from a single slab of red cedar with 2 legs cut from cedar rounds. It sat at the edge of the trail facing downhill, positioned so that anyone sitting on it would look back down over the creek bottom they'd just climbed out of. The wood was gray with age, but solid. The joints were pegged, not nailed, and carved into the top edge of the backrest in the same plain vertical line style as the blazes was a date, 1 year after the trail closed. I sat on the bench. It didn't creak. It held my weight without any flex, which meant the legs were sunk deep and the cedar hadn't rotted, which tracks red cedar in this climate can last decades if it's off the ground. I sat there and looked down through the canopy at the pale line of Sunder Creek below, and I thought about my mother carrying a county closure notice in her purse, and I thought about someone coming out here 1 year later and building a bench. Then I smelled smoke. Not wildfire smoke. Not the broad, acrid haze of a brush fire carrying on the wind. Wood smoke, close. The particular smell of a small hardwood fire, oak or hickory. The kind of smoke that comes from a campfire or a wood stove. And it was fresh enough that I could distinguish it from the background scent of summer forest. It was coming from uphill, from the direction of the cedar breaks, and beyond them, the Prader homestead clearing. I sat on that bench for probably 5 minutes, breathing smoke-tinged air, making a decision I didn't fully understand at the time. The rational part of my brain said, someone is camping up there. Poacher, squatter, ginseng hunter, whoever. You're trespassing on a closed trail. They're trespassing on a closed trail. You don't know each other. Go back to your car. The other part of my brain, the part that had been 14 years old on this trail and was now 44 and sitting on a bench that someone had built the year after the trail was taken away from me. That part wanted to know who. I kept going. The cedar breaks were just as I remembered them, or almost. The trail threaded through dense stands of eastern red cedar, the trunks close enough that in places you could touch trees on both sides simultaneously, the ground carpeted in brown needles, the air sharply fragrant even in the heat. What was different was the light. Sections of the cedar stand had been thinned, not clear-cut, not logged. Thinned selectively, the way a forester would thin a stand to promote healthy growth, removing the weakest specimens and leaving the strongest to expand their canopy. The stumps had been cut low and flat, and most were old enough to be softening into the soil. The result was a cedar forest that felt more open, more intentional than the dense thicket I remembered pushing through as a kid. The smoke got stronger as I climbed. I could see it now, a thin haze drifting through the cedars at canopy level, blue-gray in the late afternoon light. And then the cedars opened, and I was at the edge of the Prader clearing. The clearing was wrong. Not wrong in the sense that something bad had happened to it. Wrong in the sense that it had changed in ways I couldn't immediately categorize. And my brain kept trying to overlay the memory on the reality and failing. When I was 14, the Prader clearing was a quarter-acre opening in the forest where a homestead had stood some time before the Second World War. The chimney stones were still there, scattered in a rough rectangle. The clearing was maintained by natural processes, deer grazing, periodic ice storms opening the canopy, the thin, rocky soil discouraging tree encroachment. It was wild. It was a clearing because it had been a clearing, and inertia kept it open. Now it was a garden. Not a garden in the suburban sense, not raised beds and tomato cages. But the clearing had been expanded, maybe doubled in size, and the ground that wasn't trail or rock had been planted. I could see black-eyed Susans, purple coneflower, bee balm, and at least 3 species of native grass that I recognized from prairie restoration projects I'd written about for a trail guide in the Ozark National Scenic Riverways. This was deliberate. Someone had seeded this clearing with native plants and maintained it carefully enough that it looked natural at first glance. But the species composition was too diverse and too well distributed to be accidental. The old chimney stones had been gathered and restacked, not into a chimney, into a low, circular wall, maybe 2 feet high and 6 feet across, that formed a fire ring. And in the fire ring, a small fire was burning. Oak splits, neatly stacked, flames low and steady. Someone had built this fire recently. Within the hour. I stood at the edge of the clearing and I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded strange to me. Too loud. The wrong register for the place. No answer. The fire crackled. A wren sang from somewhere in the cedars behind me. I walked to the fire ring and looked at it more carefully. The stones were the same ones I remembered. I recognized a piece of the old chimney's capstone, a flat piece of sandstone with a natural curve on one edge that I'd sat on as a kid. It was mortared into the wall now, set with a gray cement that matched the stone almost perfectly. Next to the fire ring, on the ground, was a pair of leather work gloves, a hand saw with a wooden handle, and a plastic water bottle half full of water. The gloves were worn thin at the fingertips. The saw blade was bright, recently sharpened. These were someone's tools, left here the way you leave tools when you've walked away for a few minutes and plan to come back. I want to tell you that I handled what came next well, that I was calm, professional, measured. I wasn't. My hands were shaking, and not because I was afraid. I was angry, and I was grieving, and I didn't know which one was winning. Someone had taken this trail that had been taken from me and made it into something beautiful, and they'd done it in secret for 30 years. And I had spent those 30 years driving past the turnoff and not stopping. And I didn't know if I was angry at them for doing what I hadn't, or at myself for never coming back to find out. I sat down next to the fire ring on the grass, in the shade of a cedar that someone had left standing at the clearing's edge when they thinned the rest. I sat there and waited. Because whoever had built this fire was coming back for their gloves and their saw, and I wanted to see their face. I waited 40 minutes. The fire burned down to coals. The shadows in the clearing shifted east. I heard footsteps. They came from the far side of the clearing, from a direction where I didn't remember a trail existing. A woman, maybe 60, maybe older, wearing canvas work pants and a long-sleeved shirt despite the heat, carrying a bundle of thin cedar branches under one arm. She was small, weathered in the way that outdoor people get weathered, not tanned but textured, the skin on her forearms brown and loose. She wore her hair in a short gray cut and walked with a slight hitch in her left leg that looked structural, not injured, old, something she'd always had. She saw me before I could speak. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 feet away, and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as recognition. Not surprise, not alarm. She looked at me the way you look at something you expected to see eventually. "You're June Breland's boy," she said. I hadn't heard my mother's name spoken by a stranger in 7 years. The sound of it emptied me out. I couldn't answer immediately. I just nodded. She walked to the fire ring, set the cedar branches down next to the saw, and picked up the water bottle. She drank from it without taking her eyes off me. Then she said, "She told me you'd come back. I just didn't think it would take this long." Part 2. I found my voice, but what came out wasn't the question I thought I'd ask. I didn't say, "Who are you?" or "What is this place?" or "How did you know my mother?" What I said was, "She knew about this?" The woman sat down on the other side of the fire ring, on a flat stone that was clearly her stone, worn smooth in the way a seat gets worn when the same person uses it for years. She set the water bottle between her feet and looked at the coals. "She knew about me," she said. She didn't know about all of this. Not at the end. She knew I was out here, and she knew I was going to stay out here. And she made me promise something I've spent 30 years keeping. Her name was Colleen Prader. When she said it, the name hit me physically, the way a word can when it suddenly connects to something you thought was just geography. Prader, as in the Prader homestead, as in the Prader clearing. I'd walked this trail for 6 years as a kid and never once wondered whether there were still Praders in Dent County. The homestead was a ruin. The name was on a map. It hadn't occurred to me that a map name could still be breathing and carrying cedar branches through the woods. She told me the story in pieces, not linearly, not the way someone tells a story they've rehearsed, but the way someone talks about their own life when they haven't had to explain it to anyone in a very long time. I'm going to reconstruct it as clearly as I can. But I want to be honest that I'm imposing order on a conversation that didn't have much. She'd say something, then go quiet. Then she'd get up and adjust the coals or pick up the saw and do something with her hands. And then she'd sit back down and continue from a different point. And I'd have to figure out where it connected. The Prader family had owned the land this clearing sat on since 1919. Her great-grandfather had built the homestead. Her grandfather had been born in it. Her father had been the last person to live in the structure before it fell in on itself during a storm in 1974. By then, the family had moved into Salem, the county seat, and the land was just a piece of a larger parcel that nobody was using. The county trail easement had been granted by her grandfather in 1947 as a handshake formalized on a single page of paper that Colleen said she still had in a filing cabinet in Salem. The easement allowed foot traffic across the Prader parcel and the adjacent Gooch parcel to the north. When old Dale Gooch died in 1993 and his land was sold to a man from St. Louis who planned to lease it for hunting, the new owner looked at the easement, decided he didn't want strangers walking through his hunting lease, and told the county he wouldn't honor it. The county, rather than litigate, simply closed the trail. My father was still alive then, Colleen said. He was furious. Not about the trail, about the principle. His father had given that easement so people could walk through. It was a gift, not a favor. And some man from St. Louis could just undo it because the county didn't want to spend money on a lawyer. Her father died in 1996. 2 months after the trail closed. Colleen told me this flatly, without drama, but the sequence clearly mattered to her. The trail closed in April. Her father died in June. And in September of that year, she walked in from Route TT for the first time since she was a child and started working. "I didn't have a plan," she said. "I wasn't trying to make a point. I just needed to be here. And once I was here, I could see what it needed." The first year, she cleared blowdowns. That was all. She walked the trail every 2 or 3 weeks, removed whatever had fallen across it, and walked out. She built the bench in the fall of 1997, after her first full summer on the trail, because the climb out of the creek bottom had gotten harder for her. As she got older and she wanted a place to rest, she carved the date into it because she wanted to mark the beginning of something, even though she didn't know yet what it was. The stonework came later. The creek crossings, the steps cut into the slope. She'd learned masonry from her father, who'd learned it from his father. who'd built the homestead chimney with stone pulled from the same creek bed. Colleen described the work the way a craftsperson describes their craft, with technical specificity and a complete absence of vanity. The creek slabs had to be levered into position during low water in late summer. The step stones needed a bed of compacted gravel beneath them to prevent frost heaving. The switchbacks she'd cut into the slope above the first crossing had taken her 3 years because she could only move so much soil per visit, and she refused to use power tools because the sound would carry. The gooch buyer never came out here, she said. He leased the hunting rights and stayed in St. Louis. His lessees used the property on the other side, near the road. Nobody walked this direction. I could have run a chainsaw and nobody would have heard it. But that wasn't the point. I asked her what the point was. She looked at me for a long time. Coals ticking in the fire ring. A turkey vulture circling overhead, riding a thermal that came up off the creek bottom. "Your mother asked me the same thing," she said. I told her the same thing I'll tell you. I don't know. I just knew it would be wrong to let it go. My mother. I kept coming back to that. She'd said my mother knew about her. She'd said my mother told her I'd come back. These two facts sat in my chest like stones, and I couldn't move around them. I asked her when she'd met my mother. How? 1999, she said. Fall. I was working on the upper crossing, the second one, where the creek bends south. I heard someone coming down the trail, and I almost left. I always left when I heard someone. But it was a woman alone, and she was walking slowly. And when she got close, I could see she was crying. She wasn't lost. She knew exactly where she was. She was just walking and crying. She looked at me carefully when she said this, as if gauging whether I could hear it. I could. We talked for about an hour, Colleen said. She told me about you, about the trail, about how you'd walked it together, and how the closure had been the first time you'd understood that a place could be taken away. She'd come back to walk it one more time. She said she didn't know why. She said she just needed the walk. She never told me she went back, I said. I know. I asked her not to. That landed hard. I must have shown it, because Colleen went quiet for a while and let me sit with it. When she spoke again, her voice was softer but not apologetic. I asked her not to tell anyone, not you, not anyone. If people knew the trail was being maintained, they'd come. If they came, the gooch buyer would notice. If he noticed, he'd put up a fence or press charges or both. And everything I'd done would get bulldozed for a food plot. And she agreed, I said. She did more than agree. She understood. She said she'd rather know it was here and not be able to come back than watch it get destroyed because she couldn't keep her mouth shut. Colleen paused. She was the only other person who walked this trail in 30 years. Until today. I want to describe what I felt at that moment, but I'm not sure I can do it accurately. There's a kind of grief that doesn't come from loss. It comes from learning that someone you loved had a whole pocket of experience, a whole set of decisions that you never saw. My mother had walked this trail in 1999. She'd met this woman. She'd been asked to keep a secret, and she'd kept it. She'd driven past the Route TT turnoff with me in the car, probably dozens of times in the years after, and she'd never said a word. She died in 2018 holding that secret. And Colleen had been out here the whole time, building steps and planting coneflower, waiting for me to show up because a dead woman had told her that eventually I would. I asked Colleen about the garden, the native plantings in the clearing. She told me she'd started the restoration work in 2004, after she retired from her job at the county assessor's office in Salem. With more time, her visits became longer and more frequent. She started coming 2 or 3 times a week, parking on an old timber road that accessed the Prader parcel from the south side, a road I'd never known about because it crossed land that had been in her family and was now in a conservation easement she'd arranged herself. She had legal access to her own land. She simply walked from her land through the trees to the trail and worked. The plantings were native seed she'd collected from remnant prairies and glades across the county. Dent County has some of the best remaining examples of Ozark Dolomite glade habitat in Missouri. And Colleen had spent years harvesting seed from public land legally, she was careful to tell me, and establishing it in the clearing. The goal wasn't ornamental. The goal was to rebuild what the Prader homestead had displaced 100 years ago. She was trying to return the clearing to something older than her family's use of it. The house was here for 50 years, she said. The glade was here for 10,000. Seems like the glade should win. I asked if anyone else knew. County officials, neighbors, anyone. The Gooch buyer sold the lease about 10 years ago, she said. New owner's a timber company out of Springfield. They don't hunt it, they don't walk it, they don't even survey it. They own the trees, that's it. As long as I don't cut their trees, they'll never know I exist. And the county? She shrugged. The county closed the trail. They didn't burn it. The easement over my land was never revoked. Only the Gooch easement lapsed. So half the trail is still technically legal, my half. She smiled for the first time. I just maintain a little more than my half. We talked until the light changed. The clearing went from full sun to that particular late afternoon Missouri gold, where everything looks like a photograph of itself. Colleen rebuilt the fire with small cedar splits, and the smoke rose straight in the still air. And I sat there, trying to fit 30 years of hidden work into my understanding of a place I thought I'd lost as a teenager. Then she showed me the thing I still can't explain. She said, "There's something I want you to see. Your mother saw it too. She's the one who told me to leave it alone." She led me out of the clearing on the path she'd come in on, the one from the south that I hadn't known about. It was narrower than the main trail, more of a deer path that had been gently widened, threading through mature hardwoods on flat ground. We walked for maybe 10 minutes, the light coming in sideways now, long shadows running parallel to our direction of travel. Then she stopped. We were at the edge of a sinkhole. Missouri is karst country. Sinkholes are common. I've seen hundreds of them. They range from shallow depressions the size of a car to gaping pits 50 feet across that open into cave systems. This one was moderate, maybe 20 feet in diameter, roughly circular, with steep sides dropping about 12 feet to a flat bottom of bare rock and mud. Standard Ozark sinkhole. I've written descriptions of a dozen of them for trail guides. You warn hikers to stay back from the edge. You note that sinkholes can be unstable. You move on. But this one had a tree growing in it. A single bur oak, rooted in the rock at the bottom of the sinkhole. Its trunk rising straight up through the pit, and its crown spreading above the rim at ground level. The tree was large. Not ancient, but mature. Maybe 60 or 70 years of growth. It had clearly been growing in this sinkhole for its entire life, which is unusual, but not impossible. Trees grow in sinkholes. They root in whatever soil accumulates at the bottom, and they reach for the light. What was unusual was the trunk. The trunk was scarred, not blazed, not carved, not marked by human hands. The scars were natural. Frost cracks, lightning damage, old wounds that had healed into thick ridges of callous tissue. But the pattern of the scarring was what Colleen wanted me to see. The scars on the trunk, starting from about 4 feet above the sinkhole floor and extending up to where the trunk cleared the rim, were arranged in a rough spiral. a continuous line of healed damage that wound around the trunk like thread around a spindle, making, by my count, 4 complete revolutions before the bark smoothed out above the rim. I found it in 2002, Colleen said. I was clearing brush on the south path, and I nearly walked into the hole. The tree caught my eye because it shouldn't be this big. Bur oaks and sinkholes usually stay stunted. Not enough soil, not enough light. This one grew like it had everything it needed. I climbed down into the sinkhole. Colleen watched from the rim. Up close, the spiral scarring was clearer. Each line of healed bark was about 2 inches wide, slightly raised, and the wood beneath was darker than the surrounding trunk, as if the cambium in those lines had responded differently to injury than the rest of the tree. I touched it. The scarred wood was warm, not sun-warm. The trunk was entirely in shade at this depth. But the scarred spiral was distinctly warmer than the unscarred wood surrounding it. Your mother noticed that too, Colleen said from above. She put her hand on it, and she pulled it back, and she looked up at me and she said, "Don't cut this tree down. Don't let anyone cut it down. Just leave it." "Why is it warm?" I asked. "I don't know." "Is it always warm?" "Every time I've touched it. Summer, winter. It's always a few degrees warmer in the scarred parts." I pressed both palms flat against the spiral and held them there. The warmth was unmistakable. Not hot, not feverish, just warm. The way living skin is warm, a steady, low heat that didn't fluctuate in the 30 seconds I held contact. The unscarred bark on either side of the spiral was cool, the normal temperature of shaded wood on a summer afternoon. I looked down at the base of the tree where it met the rock floor. The roots had split the limestone. You could see them, thick as my wrist, driving into cracks in the bedrock and widening them. In the gaps between the roots and the rock, I could see darkness, open space beneath the sinkhole floor. The tree wasn't just growing in a hole. It was growing into something deeper, its roots penetrating into a cavity below the visible bottom. "How far down does this go?" I asked. "I dropped a rock once," Colleen said. "Through that gap by the biggest root. It took about 2 seconds to hit. 2 seconds is roughly 60 feet. That's not a sinkhole. That's a cave entrance." I stood in the bottom of that pit with my hands on a tree that was warmer than it should have been, rooted into a cave system that nobody had mapped, spiraled with scars that followed a pattern too regular to be random damage. And I felt something shift in my understanding of what Colleen had been doing out here for 30 years. She hadn't just been maintaining a trail. She'd been standing guard. Whether she thought of it that way or not, whether she'd have used that word, but she'd built the trail, the garden, the whole careful architecture of secrecy and maintenance. All of it circled back to this sinkhole and this tree the way a fence circles a yard. Everything else was the perimeter. This was the center. I asked her if she'd ever gone down, into the cave, through the root gaps. "No," she said. "I thought about it. I have rope. I could rig something. But your mother told me not to, and I made her a promise." "She made you promise not to go into the cave?" "She made me promise not to go looking for an answer I didn't need. She said the tree was doing fine on its own. She said whatever was down there was keeping it warm and keeping it growing. And if I went down there, I might find something that would make me feel like I had to tell someone, and then everything I'd built would be over. She said the smartest thing I could do was exactly what I was already doing. Take care of the surface. Let the rest be." That sounded like my mother. Practical, certain. A woman who knew exactly how much truth she wanted and was never ashamed to stop at her own line. I'd always admired that about her and been frustrated by it in equal measure. She was the kind of person who could hold a county closure notice in her purse and walk the trail one last time and never go back, not because she didn't care, but because she decided that her caring had a shape, and that shape did not include fighting a battle she couldn't win. I pulled my hands off the tree. The warmth lingered on my palms for a few seconds and then faded. We climbed out of the sinkhole together. Colleen used a knotted rope she'd tied to a nearby tree, something she'd clearly done many times. We walked back to the clearing in near silence. The fire was down to white ash. The shadows had reached the eastern tree line. At the clearing, I asked her the question I'd been holding for 2 hours. Why did you let me see it? You could have stayed hidden. You heard me coming. You could have left. She picked up her gloves and her saw. Because I'm 68 years old, and my knee is getting worse, and one of these winters, I'm going to slip on those creek stones, and that'll be the end of me and the end of this trail, and nobody will know any of it ever existed. Your mother said you'd come back. She said when you did, I should show you everything and let you decide. Decide what? Whether to keep going or to stop where she stopped. I walked out the way I'd come in. The light was failing, and the trail that had felt generous and beautiful on the way in now felt long and uncertain in the dusk. The stone steps were slippery with evening moisture. The creek crossings required more care than I'd given them in daylight. I reached my car at Route TT with maybe 20 minutes of light left and sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and the windows down and the cicadas roaring in the trees. I went back the next morning. I brought rope, a headlamp, a helmet I keep in my truck for scrambling, a small day pack with water, a first aid kit, and my phone for photographs, even though there'd be no signal to send them. Colleen was already at the clearing when I arrived. She looked at my pack and my rope and my helmet, and she didn't say anything. She walked me to the sinkhole. I rigged the rope to the same tree she used, doubled it, and lowered myself past the bur oak's roots into the gap in the limestone floor. The cave opened immediately below the sinkhole bottom. A vertical drop of about 8 feet, then a sloping passage heading roughly north. The ceiling high enough to walk upright, the walls smooth limestone with the characteristic scalloping of water-carved rock. The air was cool, maybe 55 degrees, and humid. My headlamp lit up the walls in pale gray, and I could see the oak's roots above me, filling the ceiling of the entrance chamber like a network of wooden pipes, some as thick as my thigh, penetrating the rock and following cracks deeper into the formation. I followed the passage for about 200 feet. The floor was clean. No debris, no animal bones, no scat. Either nothing lived down here or the water scoured it regularly. The passage narrowed gradually, and at the point where I'd have to start ducking, I found the wall. Not a cave wall, a built wall. Dry stacked stone, floor to ceiling, filling the passage completely. The stones were the same local dolomite, but they'd been shaped. Flat faces on the passage side, fitted tightly, no mortar. The construction was identical in style to Colleen's creek crossings, her fire ring, her stone steps. But this wall was old. Older than Colleen's work. The stone surfaces were covered in a fine mineral deposit, a white calcium crust that takes decades to accumulate in a cave environment. This wall had been here for a very long time. I put my hand on it. The stone was warm, not the ambient 55 degrees of the cave. Warm, the same gentle, steady warmth I'd felt in the oak's spiral scars. The wall was warm the way the tree was warm, as if something on the other side was generating heat. Not much. Not enough to be uncomfortable, but enough to register unmistakably against my palm. I pressed my ear to the wall. I held my breath and listened. I heard moving air. Not wind, not the passive draft you feel in a cave with two entrances. A rhythm, a slow, deep oscillation, like the cave itself was breathing through the stone, in and out, with a period of maybe 15 seconds between each pulse. In, out, steady as a sleeping animal. I stayed there for about 5 minutes, my ear against that warm wall, listening to whatever was on the other side of it breathe. Then I climbed out. Colleen was sitting on the rim of the sinkhole, with her legs dangling over the edge, the same way you'd sit on a porch. She watched me come up the rope, and she didn't ask what I'd found. She just watched my face. "There's a wall down there," I said. "I know," she said. "I built it." I stared at her. "Not that wall," she said. "My grandfather built that wall. 1931, according to his journal. He went down there after the homestead well started producing warm water, and he followed the passage, and he found the warm spot, and he sealed it. He didn't write down why. He just wrote that he sealed it, and that the well went back to normal, and that was the end of it." She looked at the oak tree growing out of the sinkhole beside her. The tree sprouted the next spring. He noted that too. Little oak growing out of solid rock, right where he'd sealed the cave. He thought that was interesting. He didn't think it was connected. But you think it is. I think the tree is growing because of whatever's behind that wall. I think the warm water in the well was coming from the same source. I think my grandfather sealed the passage, and the heat found another way up. And it found it through that tree. What's the source? I don't know. You've never taken the wall down. My grandfather built that wall for a reason. Your mother told me to leave it alone. I've spent 30 years taking care of the surface. That's enough for me. She paused. Is it enough for you? I sat on the rim next to her. Below us, the oak rose out of the dark like a pillar, its spiral scars facing us, the warmth invisible but present. Whatever was behind that wall had been there since at least 1931, probably much longer. It had warmed a well. It had been sealed by a man who didn't explain why. It had grown a tree out of solid rock. It had pulsed against my ear like breath. I thought about my mother at this sinkhole in 1999, touching the tree, pulling her hand back, looking up at Colleen and saying, "Don't cut this tree down. Leave it." I thought about her driving past the Route TT turnoff with me in the passenger seat, holding the secret of this place inside her the way you hold a breath you're afraid to release. I told Colleen I wouldn't take the wall down. I told her I wouldn't write about the sinkhole in any guide. I told her I'd come back, and I'd help her maintain the trail. And when her knee finally gave out, I'd take over the work. She nodded, as though this was the answer she'd expected. And we walked back to the clearing together. And she rebuilt the fire. And we sat there as the morning heated up, and the cicadas started, and neither of us said anything for a long time. I drove home that afternoon. 3 hours on back roads through the Ozark Hills, the windows down, the air thick with August. I kept thinking about the wall, about the rhythm I'd heard behind it, about the warmth in my palms. I kept thinking about my mother's logic, which was the same logic Colleen lived by. Take care of the surface, let the rest be, and trust that some questions survive better unanswered. I believe she was right. I'm not sure I'm the same kind of person she was, but I believe she was right. What I can't stop thinking about, though, the thing that sits in my chest, the way those chimney stones sat in the clearing before Colleen made them into something new, is this. When I pressed my ear to that wall and listened to the rhythm, slow and deep and steady as something sleeping, I felt the walls shift. Not crack, not crumble, shift. A quarter inch, maybe less. The whole surface moving outward against my ear in a single smooth motion, then settling back, as if the thing behind it had adjusted its weight, as if it knew I was there. I've gone back twice since then. I've cleared blowdowns on the lower trail. I've re-chinked the first creek crossing where spring runoff displaced 2 of the filler stones. I've sat on the bench Colleen built in 1997 and rested my legs before the climb. I have not gone back into the cave. I have kept my promise. I take care of the surface. But the last time I was at the sinkhole, standing at the rim in the early morning before Colleen arrived, I looked down at the bur oak and noticed something I hadn't seen before. A new scar on the trunk, fresh. The exposed wood still pale and wet with sap. It was on the lowest visible section of the spiral, just above the roots, in a place that gets no sunlight and no wind and no animal contact. A new wound in the pattern, continuing the spiral downward, toward the roots, toward the rock, toward whatever the roots were reaching into. The spiral is still growing. It has been growing for 70 years, and it is growing down. And the wall my hands remember is warm and patient and 1/4 inch closer to the passage than it was the day it was built. I maintain the trail. I keep the secret. I honor the promise. I just don't know how much longer the wall will honor it too.